Okay, so I am going to talk about communication. I'm going to talk about what we mean by meaningful communication, and then I'm going to try and put it in a bit of a business context and then share a bit of my own experiences with you. The first thing I'm going to say, though, is I speak very fast. I know this about myself. I also know that I speak faster when I present, and I speak even faster when I'm excited. So we're going to talk about communication being interactive and a two-way kind of street. So if I'm speaking too fast, make a sign. Whatever sign you like, it can be rude, I will respond to that. So please do, I mean that, please do. So why do we communicate? It seems like a pretty straightforward question. And as Jane said in the introduction, I think it's because we can't not. It's often said that humans are distinguished from other types of animals by our structured and verbal language, although there are many different types of communication. But I think communication isn't just about this kind of thing, giving information or exchange of information. It's actually more about our human need to express ourselves and our human need to be understood. So actually, without communication, we can't really interact with the world around us or understand our place in it. So I think communication is, at its heart, what makes us human beings. Communication is about bonding, it's about belonging, it's about finding and measuring our place in the world. And basically, that's my premise, and I'm going to kind of explore it a little bit in the next, hopefully, half an hour. Jane's going to tell me if I'm running over. But this will be the longest presentation, so don't worry, you're going to be here till 2 in the morning on Friday. So, my last click didn't click. Okay, right. So, which of these are forms of communication? And which of these aren't, and which of these do we think are richer or better in certain circumstances? Feel free to shout up. So this is, I think, obviously communication. It's one way, but it's imparting information. Is this communication? I think we all spend I've seen Arash doing this already, by the way, tonight. So, these people aren't communicating with each other, or maybe they are, which would be a little bit sad, but it's clearly a form of communication. I keep in touch with a lot of friends through This Means Only, that I probably wouldn't even speak to or have any contact with on a year-to-year basis without the beauty of chat. Non-verbal language. I mean, there are no words being exchanged here, but I think there's clearly a pretty significant form of communication happening between these two people. Body language. We'll touch on body language. See, this says a lot, right? The picture says 1,000 words. I like the hand of friendship and the eyes of hatred in here. And I think just after that, Andrea Merkel pulled out a gun from behind her back, and it looks like that's what's about to happen to me. Touch, again, non-verbal, but a very expressive form of communication, I think. And whilst we're talking about human communication tonight, the human equivalent photos of this were a little bit too explicit to use in a presentation, so I thought I'd go for the dog form. Communication, I think, is also about curiosity. That was my point there. Communicating with a work of art, not even another person or another being. For me, this is a really rich form of communication, something I do a lot, and Jane too. Who's ever felt the joy of being in a crowd at a concert, at a gig? I think that can be a very social experience, and it's communication of a different type. And these people, they're not saying a word, but I think they're speaking volumes. So would anyone like to disagree that that any of these aren't a form of communication? Thank goodness for that, right. So the kind of, just to kind of drive that point home, Paul Václavic, I think is how you pronounce it, is an Austrian-American family therapist. And he said, one cannot not communicate. And the full version of that quote is, every behavior is a form of communication. Because behavior does not have a counterpart, there is no such thing as anti-behavior. It's impossible not to communicate. So even if communication is being avoided, that is a form of communication. I think that kind of says it quite well. But understanding the words is one thing, but I want to take a minute for us all to kind of really feel this, just to drive the point home. So close your eyes if it helps, but I want you all to imagine a world without communication for a couple of minutes. So firstly, imagine no mobile phones. I can feel the panic rising. No internet, you can't even get on the internet when you get home. And then how about when you get there are no books? And more than that, there is no reading, there's no writing, there's no written language. And then how about a world where there's no speech? Silent world. How about a silent world where you can't make eye contact with anybody? How about a silent world where you can't make eye contact with anybody, where everybody has to wear the same thing and hold their bodies in a way that doesn't express anything about themselves? And I think in that kind of world, ask yourselves how you would know who you are, and how you would know anyone else, and how you would know what you value and what you love and what you like and what you dislike. I don't think you would. I think that's basically the point. So communication is everything, a decent start point. Without communication, there's no business, there's no economy. The projects that we're all working on would be impossible to get off the ground. And actually, it's one of the reasons that we think it's an important area to cover in Commerce, because communicating well and meaningfully is a fundamental part of what it is to be human, and to get a deal done, actually, in the context of all of our projects. So, I'm just going to look at linguistic communication for a minute now, just going to dive into it in a little bit more detail. And when I was thinking about writing this presentation, I thought that one of the particular things about this audience is that to some extent, all of us are working either cross-culturally and or across languages. And, you know, we all know how hard it is to have the right communication and have the right kind of conversation and get your message across and feel really understood in your native language. It's kind of a lot harder in a second language of any type, however fluent you are, however long you've been working on that challenge. So not only are the words that you choose important, but I think the words that you choose, whether you mean to or not, and actually whether you try to hide it or not would be almost irrelevant. It says a lot about your place, where you're native from, what your class is, what your age is, what your gender is, what your background is perhaps, what your educational background is. So we choose words carefully. It's harder in another language, but actually, despite that, the way we say things says an awful lot more about us than the words themselves. So just a really simple example. There are a lot of ways to say, how are you? And that's just two examples. If you can't, and I think, as I'm assuming that everyone's going through, is at some point on the journey of learning a second language, and we all know that it's quite different to get by at a transactional level versus be understood and communicate at a more profound level. So many people said to me when I moved here, can you order a beer in Spanish? That's okay, then you'll be fine. But there's kind of some truth in that. It's transactional, and it works for me on 7 days a week. But but I wouldn't call it necessarily meaningful communication. And then just looking at culture as well. Again, I think we're all probably working cross-culturally in a number of different ways. Sorry? Ooh, there we go, thank you. And the thing that can be, I think, quite hard to know about ourselves is the values that we carry with us that for us are natural, but are actually learned. And sometimes that doesn't really come to the fore until you are working in a different culture. I've got a couple of, this is Google, these are not my words coming up, by the way, but my point here is we all carry quite a lot of prejudice, whether we recognize it or not. Shout out which nations are being described here. And, yeah, okay. How about, sorry, that's not very clear. That says drunk men, big women, gambling, vodka, and organized crime. Yeah. Heavy metal? Yeah. You don't even need the IKEA there, I don't think. I fundamentally disagree with this, but I love the fact that ugly is the first word, but anyway. Anyone like to take? Yeah. And yeah, and the last one. So it's funny, but we carry a lot of stereotyping with us, and sometimes it's harmless, and sometimes it maybe isn't harmful, but can prevent us from doing the best job, particularly in when we're building projects and building businesses. Slightly more seriously, I'm just going to do a couple of slides on this. The next two slides are from a book called Riding the Waves of Culture by Fons Trompenaar, Dr. Fons, which must be one of the best names in the world. And what he did, in a business context most specifically, identified 7 different axes of values that differ depending on where you're from in the world. Now, we're already grouping huge chunks of the planet into kind of big areas here, so obviously they're massive generalizations. But just to give this as an example, a neutral culture is a culture where, in a business environment, behaviors that like self-possession and control and being methodical and being assured are valued, and being expressive and being slightly more emotionally driven aren't. The effective cultures are at the other end of the scale. I've got lots of examples of getting stuck in the middle of this, but I do remember the first time I, as a Northern European, negotiated against an Italian, and he walked out of the room 3 times. I had no idea what was happening. I think he might have been having a cigarette or possibly an espresso, but at kind of moments where we seemed to have reached an impasse, he literally walked out of the room and I didn't know what was happening. So I just stayed there being very prim and waited for him to come back so we could get back to the points of action. But I think that kind of expression of passion, expression of emotion, where I'm from, isn't very common in the business world, but that doesn't mean that it's the same everywhere. This one is about time. So the left-hand circle is the past, the middle circle is the present, and the right-hand circle is the future. The relative size indicates the kind of importance to each of those nations, just nationally speaking, and the level of overlap is how much each nation sees a correlation between what happened in the past, the present, and what will happen in the future. So imagine for a moment a Japanese person negotiating with a Venezuelan, and perhaps the kind of Japanese symbol there would indicate that there's obviously high relatedness between past, present, and future. So perhaps there's an expectation of continuity in a business relationship that's being formed, and most focus on what that relationship will do for the person in the future. Whereas in Venezuela, there's no relationship between anything really, just as an example. So just to conclude that section, communication, like everything, only happens in a cultural context. So understanding what we're expressing and how that's received is tricky at the best of times, and even tricky when we're outside of our native culture. And I think it's something that we particularly as a group need to be aware of. You're never going to be able to spot all of those differences, but being aware of them is probably a good start. So, comment ça, we use philosophy, psychotherapy, and arts and culture as kind of broadly our theoretical framework, so I thought I'd better have a look at some philosophers. And Oscar has written reams of notes on the full course on communication, which I have shamelessly borrowed from, and only picked the ones that support my point of view. So just this, I'm not claiming this is a literature survey that covers absolutely everything. But firstly, the philosophy of communication is actually pretty modern compared to some of the older questions around ¿qué es la realidad? Oscar, remember that? And what is the meaning of existence? It's more sociological because communication, as we've said, is a social function. I picked this is one of the philosophers that Oscar drew out, and I like her particularly because she's a woman and she's alive, unlike these guys. But this is a kind of a breakdown of the kind of 6 functions of communication according to Papolini. We've covered some of them already, and I don't think you can really argue with too many of them. So the functions of communication according to Papolini are something which is a simple description, usually of a physical or an inanimate thing, of course. Also something which is reflexive of the behavior of a living being that has an influence on another living being, so that interchange that we talked about. And then beyond individual interactions, communication is an interchange of social values, so the cultural point that we talked about. Also the straightforward transmission of information, which can be more than the first point, which is largely about describing a state. And then the acts of sharing significant social interactions, so whether that's individually, whether that's as a group, whether that's at a more societal level. And then finally, Papolini believes that communication is the thing that forms a social unit based on shared values and a common way of life and a set of rules and laws. I like that, as I said, mainly because it supports what I was saying already. The next one is from Nicola Abagno. I may have pronounced that wrong. Who says that philosophers and sociologists use the concept of communication to refer to human relationships as relationships of reciprocal participation or understanding. So, according to this, I think communication can be understood as a synonym for coexistence or living with others, or offering at least the possibility that we can participate in meaningful interactions and be understood at a kind of fundamental human level. So, with these few examples, what they have in common is they view communication as more than an exchange of information and are concerned with all of those wider things that we've touched on. So that's the philosophy section done. Just moving on to something that's maybe a little bit more relevant for the people in this room, the art of communication for entrepreneurs. So communication is everything, it makes the world go round. Fine, but what does that mean for us? And I think, again, there are a million different definitions of what it means to be an entrepreneur, what behaviors are typical of an entrepreneur, what's successful and what isn't, and I don't claim that this is comprehensive. But I think for me, at the heart of being an entrepreneur or starting your own business is the fact that you get to decide for yourself what is important. So you can, which makes it very personal. So if you base your project on a goal which is important to you personally, that could be you want to make a big pile of money. It could be you want to do something creative. It could be you want to give something back to society. It could be any number of things. But the fundamental point is it's something that you get to decide. And because you get to decide it, the way you communicate about that business with everybody around you, with everybody who you needs to help you get there, is very personal. You become part of your own story. You are part of the story of your own business. So I think that's one thing that's very different between being an entrepreneur and working in a large corporation, for example. So another go at some typical characteristics of entrepreneurs. So I would say that we are typically people who are risk-taking, and even if that's only because we don't have the infrastructure of a big corporation behind us, I think we have to be resilient because you're out there doing your own thing and you have to be able to deal with feedback, deal with blocks in the road, deal with things that you have to work around and be kind of prepared that that will be part of the journey. But then more, I think the most importantly is you have to be responsive. So, and by that I mean responsive to the world around you, to the to feedback that you may get from various people as you go through that kind of journey of developing your business, and that takes us right back to the concept of communication being something which happens in interaction with the world. So, communication is more important to us than anyone. This next slide is the kind of classic communication chain that you see in lots of business books. That's a screen grab from Google as well. Talk about making an interesting subject look really boring and a non-sequential process look really sequential. So I'm not saying that when you're going through particularly a marketing plan or a business development plan, asking yourself the questions about what am I trying to say and to whom and what channels are most effective and what results am I looking for. I'm not saying that's not useful, but I think what it misses is the question of why. So what is it I'm trying to achieve? What is it that's important to me, again, as an entrepreneur, and how do I go about making that happen in the most effective way? And that's more than the pitch and the marketing plan. I think that's about the words we choose, but also how we say it, about what we do with our bodies, about being congruent, and about actually really believing that what you're doing is important. And for me, I'm currently mixing my time between London and Madrid and a big corporate and Commercer, which is a really interesting and quite unusual mix. But in my Commercer life, the why for me is that I want to share something that I think is good and important with other people that may feel the same. And it's something that I feel very passionately about. But I think answering that question is fundamental to starting any business. So, this model might give you a result you're looking for, if you're looking for a sale or growth or those kind of things. But I think, and you couldn't argue that anything that results in those things hasn't encompassed good communication. But how much better would it be to have great communication and create supporters and sponsors and patrons rather than just clients? I think good communication is okay, but great communication is the thing that creates a connection between your business and the world around you. So, a bit about me, or a bit more about me, in fact. Just to kind of bring that to life a little bit from my own experience. So you may or may not, well, you won't know some of these brands, but this is a combination of comms companies, IT companies, and consultancies. And they span an organization, Engage, which is 30 people, KPMG is 13,000 people, and quite a few things in between. And what I've done over the last 15 years of my career is actually an enormous amount of stuff. I started off in legal. I'm not a lawyer, but I started off in contract negotiation. I spent 8 years negotiating contracts day in, day out. And the kind of language you see and the kind of interactions you see in that world are very prescribed and very specific and very based on a common knowledge, and actually quite a lot about trying to prove who's the cleverest in the room was one of my main learnings about that. I've spent some time in business development, which is what I do now, which is much more sales and marketing led, obviously a very different communication style. I've worked in corporate strategy where I had to deal with bankers and investors, and again, that's a very kind of specific type of language and a very specific way of communicating. I've done product development, I've worked with IT people through doing that, and I've worked on service improvement in big call centers, and where I've gone out in vans with telecoms engineers to try and find ways to, if not make their jobs more interesting, at least make them less painful. So I've done a huge variety of things, and I've learned lots of things from each of those jobs. But actually, the main thing that I learned that I think is relevant for Commercer is being able to change register and being able to respond to those different environments and understand the language specifically and the communication generally, which is expected and is valuable and fruitful in each of those environments. So back to my point, I think all of those things have required me to be responsive, and I think that's probably the most useful skill you can learn. And some of the best and worst outcomes in each of those jobs that I've done have been based on either good communication or bad communication. So I like to think I was a decent negotiator, and it was mainly because I wasn't a lawyer, so I couldn't rely on that. My approach tended to be, okay, we're in a room because someone has sold something. We need to get this contract written. Let's focus on that rather than focus on maybe some of the nuances of the kind of legal points. And actually, that got us to good results, probably more quickly and certainly less painfully than some of the other negotiations I'd sat in on. And my worst example was based on fear, actually. So I think by not being open to the environment around me has resulted in some of my best examples of communication, but being locked into a personal view of what's right and wrong and what I'm worried about and closing off to the outside world are the things that have led to the worst outcomes. My worst example of that being I allowed an IT project to spend £1 million on a platform they didn't need because I wasn't brave enough to say no. And I thought, I'm not the person who knows this. I'm not the person who knows the subject matter in the room, and I don't want to be responsible for making a bad decision. So that was cowardly of me, but also an example of bad communication. So I've talked a lot about. I've talked a lot about how complicated communication is, how it's multi-level, how lots of things are happening at the same time, how we all need to be worried about the fact that we're outside of our core language and our core culture and how complicated all of that is. But the good news is I actually think it's relatively simple because a lot of those things we do instinctively. And I'm sure lots of people have read those business books that say good communication is about eye contact and building rapport and mirroring body language and active listening and open questions and all of those things. And again, I think they're useful and they have a place, but we do quite a lot of those things instinctively. And just by being open and responsive to the world around us, I think can be a more kind of useful way of getting to the outcome that you're looking for. So my closing thought is, if you're going to take one thing away, remember that you're a person first and a business person second. That's it.